This lecture is on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Let's begin with the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a cord of nervous tissue that connects the brain to the peripheral nerves. The regions of the spinal cord are named after their corresponding vertebrae: the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. The spinal cord stops growing around 4 years of age. It has a length of 17 to 18 inches in an adult, extending from the brain to the first lumbar vertebra. The conus medullaris is the terminal portion of the spinal cord. Inferior to the conus medullaris, the spinal cord branches into the nerves of the cauda equina. This illustration shows the regions of the spinal cord, the cervical in the neck, the thoracic in the chest, the lumbar in the lower back, the sacral along the sacrum, and the coccygeal along the coccyx. This is the conus medullaris, which is the inferior end of the spinal cord, and you can see that it corresponds to the first lumbar vertebra. Inferior to the conus medullaris is the cauda equina. This translates as ponytail because it looks like a pony's tail with all of the branching nerves. So though the spinal cord stops growing at the age of 4, the cauda equina continues to lengthen as you increase your height. The vertebral column surrounds and protects the spinal cord. Spinal meninges are layers of connective tissue that protect and nourish the spinal cord. There are 3 layers of meninges: the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The dura mater is a 2-layered sheet of fibrous connective tissue. The arachnoid mater is a web-like tissue filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is a delicate areolar connective tissue that clings tightly to the spinal cord. There are spaces that are important that correspond with each meninges. For the dura mater, there is the epidural space and the subdural space. The epidural space is external to the dura mater, whereas the subdural space lies between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater has a subarachnoid space, which contains cerebrospinal fluid. This illustration shows the 3 layers of the meninges. The dura mater is the external layer, the arachnoid mater is the middle web-like layer, and the pia mater is the innermost meninges that will directly contact the spinal cord. This illustration shows the epidural space between the dura mater and the vertebra, and then the thin subdural space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. The subarachnoid space is rather large and is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. A lumbar puncture, also called a spinal tap, is a procedure for withdrawing samples of cerebrospinal fluid. The needle will thus be inserted into the subarachnoid space in the lumbar region because of the abundance of cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space. A lumbar puncture will test for diseases such as meningitis and also relieve pressure if there is a buildup of fluid caused by diseases like pseudotumor cerebri. An epidural is a procedure for anesthetizing a woman whom is in labor. The needle is inserted into the epidural space in the lumbar region. Here we see the epidural space, and again on our illustration. The spinal cord contains gray matter and white matter tissues. The gray matter tissue forms an H-shaped structure with projections called horns. Posterior horns are narrow and receive axon terminals of sensory neurons. Lateral horns are small lateral bulges that contain cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. Lateral horns are found in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Anterior horns are wide and contain cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. Recall that autonomic motor neurons will send motor information to organs and glands. Somatic motor neurons will send motor information to skeletal muscles. This illustration shows the gray matter tissue of the spinal cord, and it has that H-shaped appearance. The posterior horns or dorsal horns are sensory, and they contain the axon terminals of sensory neurons. Recall that the cell bodies of sensory neurons are located in the posterior or dorsal root ganglion. Lateral horns will contain the cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons, and here's the word visceral to remind you that it goes towards the organs and glands. And then anterior horns, also called ventral horns, will contain cell bodies of somatic motor neurons, which will innervate skeletal muscles. This illustration shows the sections of the different regions of the spinal cord and the gray matter tissue within. To note is that within the thoracic as well as lumbar, we can see the lateral horns. The disease polio results from inflammation and destruction of the anterior horn by the polio virus. This results in paralysis and atrophy of skeletal muscles. Polio virus reached epidemic proportions in the United States during the 1950s. Jonas Salk developed a vaccine for polio virus in 1955. Polio virus was spread to children, as you can see here, through public water sources. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, abbreviated ALS, is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. This disease results from destruction of the ventral horn neurons. Victims eventually lose the ability to swallow, speak, and breathe. Death generally occurs within 5 years. It is more common in men, and it is unknown why that is so. And recall that ventral horn neurons are also called anterior horn neurons. Dorsal and posterior are synonyms. Ventral and anterior are synonyms. There are conduction pathways in the spinal cord that include components within the brain, spinal cord, and spinal nerves. These include sensory and motor pathways. There are common pathway characteristics, such as pathways are paired. There will be a left and a right side. Each pathway is made of a chain of neurons. Some have 2, some have 3. Most pathways decussate or cross. This means that the brain will process information for the contralateral side of the body. However, there are uncrossed pathways that will work on the ipsilateral or the same side of the body. Sensory conduction pathways carry information towards the brain. There are somatosensory pathways and viscerosensory pathways. Somatosensory pathways carry signals from the skin, muscles, and joints. Viscerosensory pathways carry signals from the viscera. Uses a series of 3 neurons to relay the sensory signal to the brain. The first order neuron has the receptor in the peripheral nervous system, and its cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. The second order neuron is an interneuron and extends to the thalamus. The third order neuron is an interneuron that extends to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe in the cerebrum. Let's look back at this illustration showing these sensory neurons coming towards and synapsing with this dorsal root or posterior root of the gray matter tissue. The cell bodies of the sensory neurons are going to be found in the posterior or dorsal root ganglion, and their axon terminals will be found in the posterior or dorsal horn. These are the first order neurons, and the light blue sensory neuron is somatic sensory, and it shows that the light blue portion of the dorsal horn will respond to somatosensory. The dark blue sensory neuron is the visceral sensory neuron, and we see the dark blue portion of the dorsal horn that corresponds with it. You also see the interneurons, which will begin the second order pathway, and they will travel all the way up to the thalamus. Recall that the thalamus, pictured in this illustration, is the sensory operator of the brain. All sensations except for olfaction or smell will synapse in the thalamus before they are sent to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex. In this case, with the sensory pathways, the thalamus will send sensory information towards the primary somatosensory cortex. If you recall, the somatosensory cortex will be sensations that we are conscious of. This illustration also shows the site of decussation or crossing over from one side to the other. So here we see the first order neuron that will connect with the second order interneuron, and then it will cross over in the medulla oblongata before traveling up to the thalamus, where it will synapse with the third order neuron that then completes the pathway by taking the sensation to the primary somatosensory cortex. Thus, the right side of the body has sent sensory information to the left side of the brain. The second illustration will show another route for crossing over. In this case, the first order neuron will synapse with the interneurons, and then the interneurons will cross over right there in that same region of the spinal cord before traveling up to the thalamus, where it will synapse with the third order neuron, which will then synapse with the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, we see that sensations coming from the right side of the body will be processed by the left side of the brain. This is another example of a sensory pathway towards the brain. We see that this is for proprioception, which is balance and equilibrium. And we have information coming from both sides of the body, and one will remain ipsilateral and one will come in and be contralateral. This helps the cerebellum, which is the organ in the brain responsible for maintaining equilibrium and balance, maintain equilibrium and balance on both sides of the body. Motor conduction pathways control skeletal muscles. They include at least two neurons, the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron originates in the primary motor cortex or brainstem nuclei, if you remember learning about the reticular formation. The lower motor neuron originates in the anterior horn of the spinal cord and excites the skeletal muscle. There are two motor pathways, the direct and indirect. The direct motor pathway is involved in conscious excitation of skeletal muscles. This originates in the primary motor cortex. It's very quick. The indirect motor pathway initiates motor commands for reflexive skeletal muscle activity and muscle tone. It originates in the brainstem, particularly that reticular formation we mentioned in the previous chapter. This illustration shows the direct motor pathway. Here, the first order motor neuron originates in the primary motor cortex. It then crosses down or travels down to the medulla oblongata, where it will then decussate or cross over. Motor neurons can also cross over in the spinal cord. Once crossed over, the motor neurons will then synapse with the second order neurons, which are large motor neurons that then travel to the skeletal muscles. Injury of the spinal cord at any level results in total motor and sensory loss in body regions inferior to the site of damage. If the injury occurs in the cervical region, all four limbs are affected, resulting in quadriplegia. If the injury occurs between T1 and L1, both lower limbs are affected, resulting in paraplegia. Hemiplegia is paralysis of one side of the body, usually reflecting a brain injury or a stroke. Now let's look at spinal nerves. Spinal nerves extend from the vertebral column. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs of lumbar, 5 pairs of sacral, and 1 pair of coccygeal. If you recall, there are 7 cervical bones, 12 thoracic bones, 5 lumbar bones, and 5 fused sacral bones, and 4 fused coccygeal bones. The reason that the number of cervical nerves doesn't correspond to the number of cervical bones is that the first pair of cervical nerves exits superior to the atlas, which is your C1 vertebrae, or your first cervical vertebrae. All other spinal nerves exit inferior to their corresponding vertebrae. So that gives the cervical nerves an extra nerve. This illustration shows the numbers of nerves in each region. So in the cervical region, there are 8 nerves, even though we know there are 7 cervical bones. The first pair of cervical nerves exits superiorly of the atlas, so it's between the occipital bone and the atlas. All other spinal nerves will exit inferiorly to their corresponding vertebra. So that adds an extra pair of nerves to the cervical pairs. Once we're in the thoracic part, all of the pairs of spinal nerves are corresponding to their appropriate vertebrae. So here we see the T1 vertebra, and the T1 pair of nerves exits inferiorly of that. And so therefore, the numbers of nerves corresponds to the number of vertebrae. Spinal nerves arise from roots that extend from the horns within the spinal cord. The posterior root contains the axons of sensory neurons. The posterior root ganglion contains cell bodies of sensory neurons. The anterior root contains motor neurons. Posterior and anterior roots join to form the very short spinal nerve, which is only a few centimeters in length. All spinal nerves are thus mixed because of the joining of the sensory and the motor roots. When we look at the gray matter region of the spinal cord, recall we have the posterior horn and the anterior horn. We also have a lateral horn in some regions. The posterior horn will belong to the sensory neurons. Recall that the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located in the posterior root ganglion, and they will synapse in the posterior horn. The motor neurons will have their cell bodies in the anterior horn and will then send their axons out into the spinal nerve as they travel towards the muscles. Here are the roots, and they actually have little rootlets as well. This reminds me of roots of a tree. The spinal nerve occurs when the roots join together. This reminds me of the trunk of a tree. So we see that the spinal nerve is mixed. It has both sensory receptors coming towards the spinal cord, and then it has motor effectors that are going towards the muscles. So recall that the spinal nerve itself is very short, only a couple centimeters in length. So pairs of spinal nerves will immediately branch into the posterior and anterior rami. Ramus means branch. So that will be like the branches of a tree. The posterior rami are small branches that innervate the muscles and skin of the back. The anterior rami are large branches that innervate the trunk and limbs. The anterior rami will form somatic nerve plexuses in the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral regions of the spinal cord. The somatic nerve plexuses will innervate the neck, abdomen, and upper and lower limbs. A plexus means branching. So these will be areas of nerves that will branch. Rami communicants are small branches that connect to ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system. These will be located in the thoracolumbar region, and we will see them again when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. This illustration shows the posterior rami that are innervating the skin and skeletal muscles of the back. And then we can see the ventral rami, which will branch and form the somatic nerve plexuses in the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral regions. Notice that there are no plexuses in the thoracic region. That is what this illustration is showing. The anterior ramus in the thoracic region curves anteriorly towards the front of the body. And you can imagine that this is going to be where your intercostal muscles are, that are in between each rib. And so that is what these nerves will be innervating. Here are the rami communicants that are going to be involved in the sympathetic nervous system activation of the autonomic nervous system. This will be important in fight or flight. We will talk about that in the next chapter. This illustration shows the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, sacral and coccygeal region. It's a good illustration because it shows the ventral rami that will form the anterior rami that will form the cervical and brachial plexuses that innervate the neck and upper limbs. Notice that there is no somatic nerve plexus in the thoracic area or region. These anterior rami will correspond to the intercostal muscles that move the rib cage. And then when we get to the lumbar and sacral region, notice these large networks of branching nerves that are forming the somatic nerve plexuses of the lumbar and sacral regions. Dermatomes are areas of the skin supplied with sensory innervation by a pair of spinal nerves. They follow sensory pathways and enter the dorsal root ganglia at specific spinal nerves. Pain, numbness, or rashes may indicate pathology of the nerve in a particular region. Dermatomes are involved in referred pain. When a visceral sensory fiber is stimulated, the central nervous system does not discern whether the pain is coming from the body wall or from the viscera, so it perceives the pain as coming from somewhere on the body wall. For example, appendicitis pain is often referred to the T10 dermatome. You may also be thinking of the sensation one has when they are experiencing a heart attack. And yes, that is considered referred pain. This illustration shows the dermatomes. In the illustration on the left, it states that it is the anterior view to show the segmental innervation of the skin, i.e. the dermatomes on the left, and the peripheral nerve supply on the right. So we see that the dermatomes are named after the region of the spinal cord that they are innervated. And so that is very important. Here's D10, which would be the appendicitis if it was on the right side of the body, so it'd be over here. And then also in this area, we can see that the dermatomes for like D2 and D3, D1, these will all correspond to the pain that a patient is feeling if they are having a heart attack. If you've seen clinicians tapping on patients' feet to ask them if they can feel a sensation, they are testing the integrity of the dermatomes. This illustration shows the referred pain. So here's the appendix, which would be that dermatome number 10, T10 for thoracic. And then here we can see the referred pain for the heart. So basically, the sensory receptors from the viscera are traveling along similar pathways. Oh, let me go a little further. Way back. But I just want to show you this illustration once more, where you see that the visceral sensory neurons are traveling along the same pathway as the somatic sensory neurons. And if you recall, somatic sensory is the skin and skeletal receptors. So we see tactile receptors on the skin, proprioceptors that would be attached to the skeletal muscles for balance. And then tactile receptors will be like touch, temperature, and pain. So these sensory neurons are traveling along a similar pathway. And thus, if your body is in intense pain in an organ, generally you will perceive that pain from the somatic sensory receptor. So you will feel it in the skin. This is extremely important from a clinical standpoint. And that's one of the reasons why clinicians will ask a patient, where does it hurt? Oops. Shingles. This is a disease caused by, the reactivation of the chickenpox virus. I hate to break it to you, but chickenpox is in the family of herpes viruses. And these viruses are notorious in that they remain dormant in nerves. This is why the herpes virus manifests periodically. Shingles affects the dorsal or posterior ganglia of the spinal nerve. And so the virus will be latent and resting in the posterior ganglia of the spinal nerve. Blisters and rashes appear along the dermatomes that have housed the dormant virus. And so here we'll see it traveling along the anterior rami in the chest region. And doesn't it look exactly like the anterior rami shown before? So here it looks like it was traveling around D7, maybe even D6. Shingles is painful, but it is not life-threatening in adults. So when you think about it, the herpes viruses, herpes simplex 1 and 2, herpes simplex 1 is what gives the cold sores in the facial region. So that is going to be stored in the facial nerve, which is a cranial nerve. And then genital herpes, which manifests in the genitalia and can even manifest on the lower limbs, the legs, it will be stored in the lumbar and sacral nerves. Okay, let's look at these somatic nerve plexuses. Somatic nerve plexuses are formed by anterior rami from the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral regions of the spinal cord. The cervical plexus innervates the neck as well as the diaphragm. The brachial plexus innervates the upper limbs. The lumbar and sacral plexuses innervate the lower limbs. The plexuses will split into multiple branches that become the nerves serving the skin and skeletal muscles. The branching network ensures damage to one nerve or spinal segment does not deprive the entire skin region or muscle of all innervation. It's kind of like a fail-proof system. What do they call that? A fail switch. Here we see the cervical plexus, which will contain nerves from C1 through C5, the brachial plexus, C6 through T1, the lumbar plexus, L1 through L5, and the sacral plexus, S1 through S5. We're going to look at each of the plexuses individually now. The cervical plexus arises from C1 through C5, and it provides sensation from and movement towards the neck. The phrenic nerve is formed from nerves C3 to C5. Here we see the phrenic nerve, and of course they'll be paired, a right and a left. The phrenic nerve provides the entire nerve supply to the diaphragm. Damage to the spinal cord in this region could result in the person not being able to breathe on their own. When you have a hiccups, that is an irritation of the muscles and a spasming of the diaphragm because of misfiring in the phrenic nerve. This shows the cervical plexus in closer detail with the beautiful branching pattern of the anterior rami. And here's that phrenic nerve arising from C3, C4, and C5. So you can see that there's branches from each one that are connecting to the phrenic nerve. The brachial plexus arises from the nerves C5 through T1, and it provides sensation to and movement of the upper limbs. The brachial plexus forms 3 cords that will branch into 5 major nerves. Here we see the 3 cords. And now let's take a look at the 5 major nerves. The 5 major nerves include the axillary nerve, the median nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, the radial nerve, and the ulnar nerve. Let's look at the axillary nerve first. If you remember, axillary is going to be near the armpit. The axillary nerve will abduct the arm or move it laterally away from the midline of the body by moving the deltoid and the teres major muscles. The deltoid is the muscle on your shoulder, the lateral side of your shoulder. The teres major is going to be a rotator cuff muscle. The axillary nerve will also bring sensory input from the superolateral arm, or the superior and lateral skin of your arm. The axillary nerve can become injured if a person is on crutches because of that armpit. So here is the axillary nerve, and you can see that it will innervate the deltoid right in here, and then the teres major will be in this area around the scapula because it's part of that rotator cuff. So crutches usually rest in this area, and that pressure on the axillary nerve can damage. The median nerve moves the thumb and the digits except for the pinky. So it moves your thumb and your pointer finger or index finger, your middle finger, and your ring finger. It provides sensory input from your palm and the dorsal digits. So the palm and the back of your digits, except for your pinky. It is affected by carpal tunnel syndrome because since it's moving the thumb and the digits, median nerve is often the one that we use when we are typing. And so you can pinpoint the median nerve right here because median means midline. So it runs down the midline of your arm, and here you can see it branches to the thumb, the pointer or index finger, the middle finger, and the ring finger. But notice that the median nerve does not innervate the pinky. So this is where carpal tunnel syndrome would occur, in this area of the median nerve. The musculocutaneous nerve will flex the arm by innervating the biceps brachii, which is the major upper arm muscle that flexes the arm, bringing the forearm towards the upper arm. The musculocutaneous nerve also provides sensory input from the lateral forearm. So if you're standing in anatomic position, it'll be the part of your forearm that is thumb side. Let's find that musculocutaneous nerve. Here it is, and it travels all the way down. So this rather large nerve, look at these branches that will innervate the biceps brachii. It'll possibly also innervate the brachioradialis, which is a synergist muscle for the biceps brachii. And that thumb side there, it's innervating the sensations from your lateral forearm. The radial nerve extends your forearm, wrists, and digits. It receives sensory input from your posterior arm and forearm and will lose sensation if you rest your head on your wrist. So if you bend your wrist and rest your face on the wrist, you are pressing on the radial nerve. So here we see the deep branches of the radial nerve, and it radiates along the humerus there on the radial side. Sometimes when you sleep at night, you might ball up and bend your wrist and rest your head on your wrist, and when you wake up, you have that sensation that your arm is dead. And that will be the radial nerve being turned off. And then you'll have the tingles as the nerve wakes back up. Another nerve that causes tingles is the ulnar nerve. This is the nerve that moves the ring and pinky fingers. It brings sensory input from the palmar and dorsal aspect of your ring and pinky fingers and is often referred to as the funny bone. This is the ulnar nerve, and it travels down to ring side and pinky side. And this is the funny bone right here. So if this medial epicondyle of the humerus and then the ulna, the olecranon of the ulna gets banged, it will cause a tingling sensation because this nerve will have been hit. The lumbar plexus arises from nerves L1 through L4. It provides sensation and movement of the anterior thigh. Two major nerves arise from the lumbar plexus, the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. The femoral nerve will extend the knee using the quadriceps muscles, and it brings sensory input from the anterior and inferomedial thigh and medial leg. This is the femoral nerve, and it will innervate the quadriceps to extend the knee. And then here's the branch of the femoral nerve that will bring sensations to the inferomedial thigh, so the bottom middle of the thigh, and then the medial leg. The obturator nerve adducts or brings the thigh towards the midline of the body and rotates the thigh medially using your thigh adductors and gracilis muscles. Also will input sensory input from the superomedial skin of the thigh. So here's the obturator muscle. So basically it's going to be your adductor nerve to bring the thighs back towards the midline of the body, and also the sensation of the skin in the superomedial portion of the thigh. The sacral plexus arises from spinal nerves L4 through S4. It provides sensation and movement of the posterior thigh and lower leg. The major nerve of the sacral plexus is the sciatic nerve. This is the largest and longest nerve in the body. It divides into the tibial and common fibular nerve. The tibial nerve flexes the knee using the hamstrings. The plantar flexion uses the gastrocnemius and the soleus. The fibular nerve provides dorsiflexion, extends the toes, inversion and eversion of the foot using the tibialis anterior and the extensor muscles. Let's look at the tibial nerve first, which flexes the knee using the hamstring and does plantar flexion using the gastrocnemius and soleus. So plantar flexion, if you remember, is basically standing on your tippy toes. So this is the tibial nerve, and it innervates the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and then standing on your tippy toes is going to be plantar flexion. Then the fibular nerve provides dorsiflexion, which is pointing your toes towards the sky, helps you to extend your toes, and then inversion and eversion of foot. So inversion is where you bend your foot inwards, eversion when you bend your foot outwards, using the tibialis anterior and the extensor muscles. So here is the fibular nerve. Look how huge that sciatic nerve is. It is the largest and longest nerve in the body. And damage to this nerve leads to sciatica. Sciatica is characterized by extreme pain that radiates down the posterior thigh and leg. It may be caused by a herniated intervertebral disc. It may also be caused by other injury. It may be caused by overuse if you go and work out too intensely without proper warm-up or training. And it can be caused during pregnancy if the developing fetus rests on the sciatic nerve in the mother's womb, and that does happen. The last section of the chapter will discuss reflexes. Reflexes are a rapid, involuntary motor response to a stimulus. There are two major types of reflexes, an inborn or intrinsic reflex and a learned or acquired reflex. Inborn reflexes are a rapid, involuntary, predictable motor response to a stimulus. Examples include rooting reflexes, which is the suckling reflex, and a withdrawal reflex if you touch something sharp or hot. Then there are learned reflexes that result from practice or repetition. So an example of that would be driving skills. So basically with learned reflexes, you are storing all that memory into your premotor cortex, and actions will then become reflexive. Reflexes occur in both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. All actions of the autonomic nervous system are reflexive. You're not consciously aware of them. A reflex arc contains the following structures: a receptor attached to a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron attached to an effector. In the steps of a reflex arc, step 1, a stimulus will activate the receptor. In step 2, a nerve signal will be propagated through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. In step 3, the nerve signal is processed in the integration center by the interneurons. Sometimes the nerve signal will loop and go right to step 4, where the nerve signal is propagated by the motor neuron to the effector, and then step 5, the effector responds. However, reflexes may also send nerve signals to the brain, and that applies higher order thinking skills to a reflex as well, which will aid in balance and coordination and ultimately your safety during a reflexive reaction, so you don't simply fall down. Testing of reflexes is clinically important to assess the condition of the nervous system. Hypoactive reflexes indicate degeneration or pathology of specific nervous system regions. Recall that hypo means below, so these are reflexes that are performing below the standard. Important reflexes for clinical testing include stretch reflexes and the withdrawal and crossed extensor reflexes. For skeletal muscle activity to be smoothly coordinated, proprioceptor input is necessary, and thus stretch reflexes will maintain muscle tone and body posture. Withdrawal and crossed extensor reflexes are initiated by painful stimuli, and they cause automatic withdrawal of the threatened body part from the stimulus. The patellar or knee jerk reflex is a specific example of a stretch reflex. Let's start with step 1. Tapping of the patellar ligament excites muscle spindle fibers located in the quadriceps. These are the stretch receptors. In step 2, afferent impulses travel towards the spinal cord. These are the sensory impulses. Remember, they are afferent. Here, the synapses occur with motor neurons and interneurons. In step 3A, the motor neurons in red send activating impulses to the quadriceps, causing it to contract, extending the knee. This helps prevent overstretching the quadriceps. It's the opposite movement of the quadriceps muscle being stretched, is to then extend the knee. That will contract the quadriceps muscles. That helps to prevent it falling down. In 3B, the interneurons will make inhibitory synapses with the ventral horn neurons that are in purple, which will innervate the hamstrings. This will deactivate the hamstrings so that they don't pull against the quadriceps as the quadriceps are contracting and extending the knee. So basically, it helps to prevent you from falling down. This is the withdrawal and crossed extensor reflex. We'll begin where the site of the stimulus occurs. So a noxious stimulus, which is one that, can elicit a intense response, causes a flexor reflex on the same side, withdrawing that limb. Here we see that the flexor will be stimulated and the extensor will be inhibited. So we're stimulating the biceps brachii in this case, and we're inhibiting the triceps brachii. How? Well, the sensory input travels first towards the spinal cord, and we can see that like we had in 3A and 3B earlier. Let's say this would be like 3B, because I think that's what corresponded to the inhibitor. So the purple is still the inhibitor, and we're inhibiting the triceps, whereas like 3A will be the exciter or the stimulator, and that is going to go in and stimulate the biceps brachii. While this is occurring, the other arm on the opposite side is going to do extension, again to help balance you while you are reflexively reacting to this noxious stimulus. And so here a neuron, an interneuron, will travel, decussate across the spinal cord, and again we will then inhibit our flexor muscle. They should have made that purple, shouldn't they have? Tisk tisk. And then they will excite the extensor muscle, which will be the triceps brachii. And they call that the site of reciprocal activation. the same time the extensor muscle on the opposite sides are activated. So that gives you that karate chop kind of balance that is very necessary, particularly if someone is trying to grab your arm. You don't want to fall down and have them get you. Here's another example of the withdrawal and crossed extensor reflex from simply stepping on a hot rock. So again, that's going to be the noxious stimulus. It's painful in this case and elicits the withdrawal. And so this time it is going to be activating. So here goes the sensory input all the way up to the spinal cord. And it's going to be activating the flexors, so your hamstrings in this case. Whereas the opposite side will be activating your extensors, your quadriceps, to hold that leg steady so you don't fall down. And if you've ever had this happen, you've noticed that if you pull your leg up really fastly, you're also moving your arm to help balance. So that's a whole upper and lower limb reflex system going on there. And these are intrinsic. You don't have to learn these. There's also superficial reflexes that respond to gentle cutaneous stimulation. So there's the plantar reflex, and this tests the integrity of the spinal cord from L4 to S2. It is tested by drawing a blunt object distally along the lateral plantar surface of the foot. So basically you start at the heel and tickle the person towards their toes on the lateral side of the foot. The normal response in adults is curling the toes down. For infants, the Babinski reflex causes the toes to fan out. And then the abdominal reflex tests the integrity of the spinal cord and the ventral rami, or anterior rami, from T8 to T12. This is done by stroking the abdomen from lateral to medial, or towards the navel. The normal response is the contraction of the abdomen, so you should see the abdominal muscles twitch. So the patient should be supine and relaxed, laying down. Use a stick and stroke briskly but lightly in a medial direction across the upper and lower quadrant of the abdomen. And the normal response is the contraction of the underlying muscle, with the umbilicus moving laterally and up or down depending on the quadrant tested, aka tickle response. Y'all feeling a little ticklish just by looking at that, right? I am. Well, I guess that was the joke. Normally I end with a little joke, but this time it's the tickle joke. So now you know one of the reasons why we're ticklish is because of that abdominal reflex. Thank you for listening and watching, and have a blessed day.